Welcome to my channel, Waiting on Parts. On this channel I like to build unusual stuff. Today I have a custom-made mahogany amplifier cabinet that I built out of 1969 Sano amplifier. I bought this amplifier with no cabinet from a guy in Hawaii. I believe the cabinet was damaged by water because I found patches of rust on the mounting tabs on the bottom of the amp. Since I didn't have a cab, I built one for it that shows off the beautiful chassis and tubes. If you want to see how I polish the chassis to a shine, check out my previous episode on my channel. First step of the build is to position your speakers on the speaker panel. Mark where the holes are going to be and cut out the holes. Now that we have completed the front speaker panel, its length will determine the width of the inside of the cabinet. So right now the top of the amp is 1 inch too long. I'm going to take a little bit off at a time until the transformer sits about 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the cabinet. It took me about 3 cuts to get this right. I'm using a crosscut sled on the table saw to make the 45-degree cuts. When positioning your project on the sled, it's super important to make sure your project is square on a sled before making cuts. I obsessively check the flat sides of my project to make sure they're parallel with the sides of the sled. If the board I'm working on is too long, before I take a little bit off the edge, I check to see which edge is not perfectly square. I take my T-square and any side that's not a perfect 90 gets a little bit trimmed off it. The goal is to get the project perfectly square. You don't want imperfections. You want the lid to be as close to 90s as possible. Here I test fit the speaker panel with the amplifier to make sure it fits before I glue everything up. I swept and vacuumed the work area before this process. I put a clean sheet of wood underneath it and cleaned each 45-degree cut before putting glue on it. I've now moved on to making the front of the cabinet. The wood supply store didn't sell a 23-inch sheet of wood, 23-inch wide sheet of wood, so I had to glue 2 sheets of wood together. It's important to find your flattest, straightest boards to join together. If you use boards with poorly fitting edges, the seam will be obvious. I also try to match the grain of the 2 boards that I'm joining together so that it doesn't stand out. I glue the front of the cabinet using plenty of clamps and let it sit for 24 hours. Here I'm checking one last time, making sure all my measurements are correct before I make the final cut. I used a hole saw and a reciprocating saw to make the opening for the front. I made sure to cut about 3 or 4 millimeters inside of where I want the final hole to be. It's difficult to make the sweeping cut for the front opening to look perfect without a lot of sanding, so it's better to leave a little extra material. Here I did some quick, some rough sanding. I just wanted to clean up the reciprocating saw, messy cuts. It was irritating me looking at it. Normally you would do the finishing sanding towards the end of the project because I still have a lot of clamping to do and it's just pointless to do it at this soon. Here I'm making the shelves that the transformers are going to sit on. I always put a piece of scrap wood in between my project and the part that I'm gluing it to. I clamped the 2 parts down tightly overnight, which would leave a nasty indentation without the buffer. woodworker could never have enough clamps. It seems like I always need more. The transformers are going to fit snugly between these 2 points. This is going to be additional bracing. Cuts like this are easy to get straight. Just align it with the edge of the crosscut sled. This piece was a tiny bit too long, so I'm going to have to shave 1 millimeter off of it. I didn't use any nails or screws to build this, only glue and clamps, and 24 hours. Here I'm making the ring that the back lid of the amplifier is gonna rest on. So this part is about 2 millimeters too long. I'm gonna shave a tiny bit off. Make sure it's square before you cut. It's still too long. I'm gonna cut a little bit more off. Here I tape the ring that the rear lid sits on in the position that it needs to be and glue it. I used a piece of scrap wood the same thickness as the back lid as a jig to measure the depth of the ring to glue it in the proper position. The rear lid is 22 inches wide, and the boards that I have are only 14 inches wide, so I have to glue 2 together. When selecting 2 boards to glue together, you need to consider 2 things. You want to select 2 boards that have perfectly straight mating edges, and you want to match the grain. When clamping 2 boards together, they have a tendency to bow outwards. So I take another set of clamps and secure it tightly horizontally to the clamps themselves. I use this little sander for intricate little pieces. I'm gonna make a piece to fill this little corner here to make it look like a rounded edge. Now I cut the rear lid down to fit snugly in its home. First thing I did for the top was measure out the center point and mark where the handle will go. I then measure up an inch to mount the preamp and control panel, at the same time making sure the preamp will clear the speakers and the rear lid. I used a reciprocating saw to cut the top opening, however I forgot to record it. This thin little sander makes finishing work easy in little cutouts like this. I shoot the spar urethane at night when everybody's sleeping to not bother others. It makes seeing the project a little challenging, but I make do with some bright lights and a respirator. I used 400 grit sandpaper in between each coat of urethane. I try to shoot the less important parts first, then move on to the outside of the cabinet last. So I shoot the speaker panel first, then move on to the rear door, lid, ring, then the rear door itself. Then I shoot the bottom of the cabinet and the inside while it's still upside down. I then flip the cabinet, finish the bottom of the cabinet, then the inside. Lastly, spray the outside of the cabinet. And I slide a table with a tarp over it to keep bugs and dust from landing on it. So at this point I have already sprayed 4 coats and the deep grain is still visible. My goal was to spray enough urethane to fill the grain, but even after 8 coats with sanding in between, some of the deeper grain was still visible. If you like my content, like and subscribe. If you're here to see some boating stuff, summer's here and I'll plan on getting out the high-speed kayak and doing some fishing and doing some experimenting with it, trying to get some more speed out of the kayak. Thanks for watching.